The lights died 3 hours before rehearsal. Not dimmed, not flickered, died. 1 second, the old theater was glowing in warm amber, the stage washed in gold exactly the way Leonard Hayes had designed it. The next second, everything went black except for the emergency strips along the floor and the red exit signs blinking like they were judging him. Somewhere in the dark, a dancer cursed. Someone dropped a prop. The stage manager shouted for nobody to move. Leonard stood at the lighting console with both hands frozen over the controls, staring at the dead board like he could bring it back by sheer hatred. "No," he said under his breath. "Not today." Today was the final technical rehearsal before the fundraiser performance. One clean show, one full house, one chance to convince donors that the Marlowe Theater was still worth saving. If tomorrow night failed, the building would be sold by the end of the month. The investors were already waiting with their glossy plans and fake smiles, ready to turn the stage into a luxury shopping space. Leonard had spent 6 weeks building the lighting design. Every cue, every fade, every shadow had been planned until his eyes burned. This show mattered. This theater mattered. And now the entire system was dead. Leonard, Mara, the stage manager, appeared beside him with a headset hanging crookedly from one ear. "Please tell me this is dramatic effect. If it was, I'd be proud of myself." Leonard hit the reset sequence again. Nothing. The board isn't talking to the dimmers. That sounds bad. It is bad. How bad? Leonard looked toward the stage, where 20 people stood frozen in half costume, lit only by the dull red emergency glow. Bad enough that if this doesn't come back, tomorrow night becomes a poetry reading in the dark. Mara closed her eyes. "I'm calling Harold." Harold retired. He knows people. He knows one electrician who still uses a flip phone. At this point, I'd let a raccoon with a screwdriver try. Leonard almost laughed, but the sound got stuck in his throat. He crouched under the console, checked the power links, the signal cables, the backup feed. Everything looked connected. Too connected. Too clean. The board had power, but the signal chain was cut somewhere between the booth and the stage grid. That made no sense. The Marlowe was old. It groaned when the wind was strong. It smelled like dust, velvet, and ancient paint. Half the doors stuck in winter. But Leonard knew its lighting system better than anyone. Old equipment failed messily. It sparked, hummed, overheated, complained before it gave up. This had gone silent all at once. Mara came back 10 minutes later. "Someone's coming." "Who?" "Chris Walker." Leonard looked up. "Who is Chris Walker?" "Specialist. Repairs old stage systems. Restores antique lighting rigs. Apparently Harold trusts him. Harold trusts soup Ken's past expiration. He said Chris is good." Leonard rubbed both hands over his face. He better be more than good. The backstage door opened 20 minutes later. Leonard was halfway inside a service panel when he heard the heavy step on the metal floor behind him. He turned with a flashlight between his teeth and immediately forgot the insult he had prepared. Chris Walker stood in the doorway, carrying a black tool case in one hand like it weighed nothing. He was tall, broad through the shoulders, wearing a black t-shirt under an open work jacket. His sleeves were pushed up, showing strong forearms marked with faint scars and a thin line of dark hair. His black hair was slightly messy, like he had run his hand through it on the drive over. His face was calm, serious, unfairly handsome in a way that made Leonard instantly annoyed. Because this was a crisis. Nobody should have looked that good during a crisis. Chris glanced around the dark theater, then at Leonard. His eyes dropped briefly to the flashlight in Leonard's mouth. "You the lighting designer?" he asked. Leonard took the flashlight out. "Leonard Hayes. Chris Walker. I heard. Good things, I hope. I heard you exist. We're starting there." A corner of Chris's mouth lifted. "Fair." Leonard stood, brushing dust from his jeans. "The main board is powered, but the dimmer racks aren't responding. Backup feed won't catch. I checked the console and something is wrong in the signal path or the grid junction." Chris stepped closer, listening without interrupting. That helped. Leonard hated people who arrived late to disasters and immediately started talking over the person already drowning in them. Chris set his case down and looked toward the stage. "When did it drop?" "During Q38. Full warm wash and a side blue. Any warning? No. Smell. Light burn near the stage left rack. Not enough for a full short. Chris nodded once. Show me. Leonard led him through the side passage toward the old technical stairwell. It was narrow, badly lit, crowded with cables and stacked cases. He moved fast because panic made him impatient. Careful, Chris said behind him. I know this place. Leonard took one more step, caught his shoe under a loose cable, and pitched forward. A strong arm wrapped around his waist and pulled him back before he hit the rail. Leonard slammed lightly against Chris's chest, breath knocking out of him. For a second, the stairwell became very small. Chris's hand was firm as waist, warm even through his shirt. His other hand held the rail beside them. Leonard froze. Chris did not let go right away. You know the place, Chris said near his ear, voice low. The cable doesn't seem to know you. Leonard swallowed. I had it under control. Clearly. I was testing your reaction time. Then I passed. Leonard stepped forward, forcing Chris's hand to slide away from his waist. The loss of contact should not have bothered him. It did. They reached the stage left rack, where Chris crouched and opened the lower panel. Leonard held the flashlight, trying to focus on wires, not on the way Chris's shirt pulled across his back when he leaned in. Chris worked quietly at first. He tested breakers, traced lines, checked terminals with quick, precise movements. His hands were rough, but careful. Nothing about him felt rushed. That irritated Leonard, too, because the comm was starting to work on him. Flashlight higher, Chris said. Leonard raised it. Not in my eyes. You said higher. I meant toward the panel, not my soul. Despite himself, Leonard laughed once. Saw the... Chris glanced over his shoulder. There it is. What? You can laugh. Good. I was worried the theater hired a haunted portrait. Leonard tried not to smile. Fix my lights, and I'll consider becoming human again. Chris turned back to the panel. Deal. The space around the rack was cramped, so Leonard had to crouch beside him. Their shoulders brushed. Then Chris reached across Leonard for a meter lead, his arm passing close enough that Leonard felt heat through the thin fabric of his own shirt. It was nothing. It was practical. It also made Leonard forget what he was holding. The flashlight dipped. Chris caught Leonard's wrist gently and guided the beam back to the panel. His fingers circled Leonard's wrist for half a second longer than necessary. Not rough. Not accidental either. Leonard looked at him. Chris kept his eyes on the wires. You always get distracted during emergencies? No. Only tonight. Only when strangers touch my wrist while insulting my theater. Chris's mouth curved. I haven't insulted the theater. You call me a haunted portrait. That was about you. That's worse. Chris finally looked at him, and the joking softened into something more direct. You're nervous. Leonard's grip tightened on the flashlight. The show is tomorrow. That's not the only reason. Leonard had an answer ready. Something sharp, probably. But Chris turned back to the rack before Leonard could use it. A few seconds later, Chris's expression changed. What? Leonard asked. Chris leaned closer to the open panel, then pulled a bundle of signal cables forward. One of them had been cut clean through. Not torn. Not melted. Cut. Leonard's stomach dropped. That wasn't where. No, Chris ran his thumb near the exposed end without touching the copper. This was done with a blade. The stairwell seemed to go colder. Leonard stared at the cable. Are you sure? Chris looked at him. I restore systems older than both of us. Old wiring phrase. Rats chew. Heat melts. This was cut. Leonard stood too quickly and hit his shoulder against the rack. Damn it. Chris rose with him. Easy. Don't tell me easy. Someone did this on purpose. Looks that way. Tomorrow is the fundraiser. If the show fails, the board sells the building. Everyone knows that. Leonard laughed once, but there was no humor in it. Of course. Of course somebody would do this now. Chris watched him carefully. Who wants the place sold? Investors. Developers. Half the board pretending they're sad about it. Leonard turned away, then turned back because anger needed somewhere to go. This theater has survived 80 years, and it might die because someone wants a boutique lobby where the stage is. Chris didn't answer right away. He looked past Leonard toward the dark auditorium. Then he looked back at the damaged cable. I can patch this section, he said. Maybe get partial control back tonight. But if the main junction upstairs was touched too, this won't hold for a full show. Leonard forced himself to breathe. Can you fix it? Chris wiped his hands on a cloth, thinking, I can make it safer. I can make it work better than it does right now. But I need to inspect the grid junction, the booth line, and the backup feed. How long? All night, probably. Leonard nodded. Fine. I'm staying. I assume. You assume. Chris closed the panel halfway and picked up his tools. You look like the kind of man who would rather collapse in a lighting booth than go home before the problem is solved. Leonard hated how accurate that was. You got all that from 10 minutes? I'm observant. You're smug. A little. Leonard should not have smiled. He did anyway. They climbed toward the upper grid. Halfway up, Chris reached back without looking. Leonard stared at his offered hand. What? Loose step, Chris said. Unless you want to test my reaction time again. Leonard hesitated only a second before taking his hand. Chris's palm was warm, calloused, steady. He pulled Leonard up with easy strength, then kept hold until they reached the top platform. The grid above the stage was darker and hotter, filled with hanging instruments and bundled cables. Leonard pointed Chris toward the main junction box. While Chris opened it, Leonard held the flashlight again, this time trying very hard not to react when Chris stood close behind him to look over his shoulder at the labels. Here, Chris said, his chest brushing Leonard's back as he reached around him. Angle it down. Leonard's breath caught before he could stop it. Chris paused. Not long. Just enough. You okay? He asked quietly. Yes. You sure? Fix the lights, Chris. A soft laugh touched the back of Leonard's neck. Bossy. Competent. That too. Chris worked the panel open. Inside, another wire had been sliced, but the damage was cleaner and more hidden. Whoever had done it knew enough to delay repairs, not enough to hide from someone like Chris. Leonard stared at it, anger folding into fear. Can tomorrow still happen? Chris studied the junction, then the stage below. For a moment, he said nothing. Leonard hated that silence. It felt like the whole building was holding its breath with him. Then Chris looked at him. Yes, he said, if we work fast. Leonard exhaled so hard his shoulders dropped. But Chris added, you listen when I tell you something is unsafe. No heroic climbing, no grabbing live lines, no pretending you're fine when you're shaking. I'm not shaking. Chris looked pointedly at the flashlight beam trembling against the panel. Leonard lowered it. Fine. Slightly shaking. Chris's gaze softened. The place matters to you. Leonard looked down at the dark stage, at the empty seats, at the faded velvet curtains waiting for one more chance. More than it should. No, Chris's voice was quieter now. Some things should matter too much. The words hit Leonard harder than he expected. He glanced at Chris, ready to deflect, but the look on Chris's face stopped him. No joke. No esmirk. Just understanding. For a few seconds, the theater felt less like a disaster and more like a secret they were both standing inside. Then Chris cleared his throat and handed him a roll of tape. Hold this. Leonard took it. That your romantic line? Chris smiled. I'm saving the good ones for after the lights come back. Leonard shook his head, but the warmth in his chest stayed. By midnight, Chris had restored enough of the system for the stage to glow again. Not fully, not beautifully, but the center wash came up, soft and uneven, spilling gold across the floorboards. Leonard stood at the edge of the stage, staring at it like a pulse had returned. Chris came down the steps behind him, wiping dust from his hands. Temporary patch. It's light. It's fragile. It's light, Leonard repeated, quieter this time. Chris stood beside him. Their shoulders almost touched. Leonard looked at the stage, then at Chris. Are you really staying all night? Chris picked up his tool case. I said I would. You barely know me. Chris's eyes moved over Leonard's face, not teasing now, but steady. I know you're trying to save something worth saving. Leonard had no quick answer for that. Chris stepped past him toward the backstage stairs, then glanced back. Come on, haunted portrait. I need someone to hold the flashlight. Leonard rolled his eyes but followed. At the stairs, Chris offered his hand again. This time, Leonard took it without pretending he needed to think about it. Chris stayed. That should not have felt as reassuring as it did. But Leonard could not deny the small, dangerous relief that settled in his chest every time he looked across the dark backstage and saw Chris still there, kneeling beside a rack of cables, sleeves pushed up, hands steady, expression focused. Most people came into the Marlowe Theater, saw the cracked paint, the old curtains, the stubborn doors, and treated the whole place like a dying thing. Chris treated it like a machine with a pulse. Tired, damaged, but not finished. That mattered to Leonard more than he wanted to admit. They worked through the next hour with only a few emergency lights and 2 flashlights between them. Leonard handled the diagrams and old cue sheets. Chris handled the wiring, the junctions, and the kind of technical decisions that made Leonard nervous because one wrong move could kill the entire system for good. "Hand me the blue tape," Chris said from inside the open panel. Leonard passed it over. Chris looked at it. "This is green. It's dark. It says green on the side. Then maybe the tape is lying." Chris glanced up at him, amused. "You argue with objects often?" "Only when they fail me before a fundraiser." Chris took the correct tape from the toolbox himself. "Good to know. I'll try not to become an object. You're already taking up too much space to qualify." Chris smiled without looking away from the wires. "You noticed?" Leonard hated that his face warmed. Everyone notices when a man built like a support beam stands in a hallway made for ghosts. That might be the nicest insult I've ever received. It wasn't nice. It had structure. Leonard shook his head, but he was smiling. That annoyed him too. He was not supposed to be smiling while the future of the theater was hanging by patch cables and Chris Walker's hands. By 1 in the morning, they moved up to the lighting grid again. The climb was narrow, and Leonard carried a coil of spare signal cable while Chris went ahead, checking each step before Leonard used it. Leonard noticed. Of course he noticed. Chris did it casually, as if protecting people was just part of his rhythm. At the upper platform, Leonard stopped near the rail and looked down. The stage seemed far below, a dark square waiting to be brought back to life. He had been up here hundreds of times, but exhaustion made the height feel sharper. Chris turned. "You okay?" "I'm fiending." "You say that fast." "Because I'm fast at being fine." Chris studied him for a second, then stepped behind him. "Move slowly. I know how to walk on a grid. I saw how you walked over one cable downstairs." Leonard opened his mouth, but Chris's hands settled lightly at his waist, steadying him without pulling him back. The touch cut off every clever answer in his head. "Just until we passed the open section," Chris said, voice close to his ear. Leonard nodded once. His body stayed stiff for 3 seconds, then betrayed him by relaxing against Chris. Chris felt solid behind him, warm through both their shirts, calm in a way that made the height less loud. They moved together across the narrow platform, step by step, Chris's hands firm at Leonard's sides. When they reached the next junction, Chris let go. Leonard missed it immediately and hated himself for that. Chris crouched near the access box. "Hold the light over my shoulder." Leonard did. "You always as bossy with people who are helping you?" "I'm polite with people who don't lie about being scared of heights." "I'm not scared of heights." Chris looked up. Leonard sighed. "I dislike them with dignity." "That's better." Chris opened the box and checked the lines. The damage here was more subtle, hidden under old wrapping. Whoever had cut the first cable had also nicked the backup feed, just enough to make the system unreliable under load. Leonard's jaw tightened. So even if we had fixed the first line, it might still fail during the show. "Yes. Perfect. Wonderful. Love that for us." Chris reached into his bag. "Sarcasm is not a repair method. It's the only tool I have left." Chris passed him a small screwdriver. "Now you have 2. Leonard laughed before he could stop himself. It came out quiet, tired, real. Chris looked pleased, but did not make a big deal of it. He went back to work, guiding Leonard through a temporary reroute. Their hands crossed several times in the tight space. Once, Chris's fingers brushed over Leonard's knuckles and stayed there while he adjusted the cable angle. "Hold this steady," Chris murmured. Leonard did. "Your hand is on mine." "I know. You need it there?" Chris glanced at him. "Technically, Leonard swallowed. Yes. Technically. No. The answer landed between them, soft and reckless. Leonard should have pulled away. Instead, he kept holding the cable, letting Chris's hand cover his. Neither of them moved for a moment. Above them, old metal beams creaked faintly as the building settled. Then Chris cleared his throat and released him. Connection set. Leonard looked away first. Good. Very convincing. Fix the lights. Yes, sir. They came down from grid with the patch backup line and headed toward the storage room behind the prop hall where the old camera recorder was kept. If the sabotage had happened near the stage left rack, there was a chance the backstage camera had caught something. The prop room was worse than Leonard remembered. Packed shelves, rolled carpets, broken chairs, fake swords, cracked masks. One wooden horse from a children's production Leonard had always found mildly threatening. Chris paused in the doorway. Is that horse staring at me? Yes. Should I be concerned? It knows things. Chris looked at Leonard. This theater is weird. This theater has personality. This theater has a cursed horse. Leonard stepped inside, trying not to smile. Recorder should be on the back shelf. Of course, the back shelf was behind a stack of old set pieces and a standing mirror covered with dust. They squeezed through carefully. Chris moved a heavy frame out of the way, but the wooden horse shifted suddenly. Leonard stumbled back, and Chris caught him again, one arm around his waist, the other braced against the shelf behind him. This time, Leonard ended up facing him. Very close. Chris's body blocked the narrow path. His arm stayed around Leonard, not trapping him, just holding him steady. Leonard could smell dust, metal, and the clean warmth of Chris's skin. You okay? Chris asked. Leonard looked at the horse over Chris's shoulder. I think it tried to kill me. Chris's mouth twitched. Jealous, probably. Of what? Chris's gaze dropped briefly to his own arm around Leonard's waist, then back to Leonard's face. Guess. Leonard's pulse kicked hard. He should have stepped away. He did not. You're very confident for a man threatened by theater furniture. I contain multitudes. Leonard laughed, and the sound eased something in the room. Chris slowly let go, but his hand brushed Leonard's side as it dropped. Not accidental. Not crude either. Just enough to leave heat behind. They found a recorder after 10 more minutes of moving props and insulting the horse. Leonard connected it to an old monitor in the control room, while Chris stood close behind him, one hand on the desk, leaning in to see the screen. The video loaded in grainy black and white. Empty hallway. Stage left rack. A timestamp from earlier that afternoon. Then a figure appeared. Leonard leaned closer. There. The person wore a cap and a dark jacket, face turned away from the camera. They moved quickly, with purpose, opened the rack, and reached inside with something thin in their hand. Chris's jaw tightened. That's our cutter. Leonard felt cold anger crawl up his spine. Someone really tried to kill the show. Looks like it. Leonard rewound the clip, then started a backup. I need to show Mara. Not yet. Leonard turned sharply. Why not? Because if the person still has access, they may come back to finish the job. If they know we have this, they'll cover their tracks. Leonard hated that Chris was right. So what do? We copy the file. Finish the repair. Keep the system watched until curtain. Leonard looked at him. You're talking like you're staying tomorrow, too. Chris held his gaze. I am. You have other jobs. They can wait. You barely know this place. Chris's expression softened. I know enough. Leonard's hand was still on the mouse. Chris's hand rested near it. Their fingers touched by accident, then stayed touching by choice. The monitor hummed. The backup crawled slowly across the screen. Leonard did not pull away. Chris looked down at their hands. You're not moving. Neither are you. No. The word was quiet, honest, and it made the small control room feel smaller. Leonard turned his head slightly. Chris was close enough that Leonard could see the dust on his jaw, the tiny scar near his thumb, the way his eyes moved from Leonard's face to his mouth and back again. Before either of them could say anything, the lights in the control room flickered. The door lock clicked. Leonard frowned and tried the handle. It did not move. Chris stepped beside him. Tell me that door always does that. Leonard stared at the locked handle, then at the frozen progress bar on the backup screen. No, he said. It really doesn't. The emergency light above them buzzed, weak and blue. Chris looked at Leonard, then at the deadlock, then back at Leonard with a tired half-smile. Well, Leonard exhaled. Don't say it. I wasn't going to. You were. Chris leaned one shoulder against the door, close enough that his arm brushed Leonard's. I was only going to say the cursed horse has an alibi. Leonard laughed despite everything, breathless and nervous. Outside the locked room, the theater stayed dark. Inside, the screen kept backing up the only proof they had, while Leonard stood shoulder to shoulder with Chris, suddenly aware that there was nowhere else to go and no easy way to stop feeling what he was starting to feel. The lock stayed dead. Leonard tried the handle twice, then pressed the release button beside the door. Nothing answered except a dull click somewhere inside the wall. Great, he muttered. Perfect. The theater is now actively participating in my downfall. Chris checked the small control panel near the frame. It's not fully dead. The safety lock engaged when the power flickered. Can you open it? Probably. That word does not comfort me. Chris glanced over his shoulder. Would you prefer definitely, even if I'm lying? Leonard leaned back against the console, arms crossed. I'd prefer a door that works. Luxury taste. The joke should have helped. It did a little, but the room was too small, the light too dim, and Chris was too close. The backup file crawled slowly across the monitor, still copying the proof they needed. Outside the room, the theater remained quiet, as if the whole building was waiting for Leonard to lose control. He hated being trapped. He hated waiting. Most of all, he hated that Chris looked calm enough to survive anything. Chris knelt by the door panel and opened his tool roll. Give me 10 minutes. You said probably. I'm upgrading to 10 minutes. That is not an upgrade. It is when I say it confidently. Leonard looked away before he smiled too obviously. He checked the backup again. 46%. Too slow. Chris worked with the door wiring, his shoulders broad under the faded work jacket. Leonard tried not to stare. Failed. Tried again. Failed worse. You're quiet, Chris said. I'm preserving oxygen. We're not in a sealed vault. Feels like one. Chris stopped working and looked at him properly. You really don't like being stuck. Leonard exhaled, sharp and tired. No, I don't. The teasing faded from Chris's face. He set the screwdriver down and sat back on his heels. Come here. Leonard frowned. Why? Because you're standing like you're about to fight the walls. I might. Then sit before the walls win. Leonard wanted to argue, but his chest felt too tight. He sat on the floor near the console, leaving a careful distance between them. Chris noticed the distance and respected it. That made Leonard feel worse somehow. For a minute, neither of them spoke. Then Chris reached into his bag and handed Leonard a bottle of water. Leonard took it. You always carry emergency supplies? I work in old theaters. At some point, every old building tries to kill you or dehydrate you. Leonard drank, then laughed quietly. The cursed horse probably started this. I knew it. That small laugh loosened something in Leonard's ribs. He leaned his head back against the console and closed his eyes. I'm sorry. For what? Being tense. Snapping. Dragging you into this disaster. Chris's voice softened. You didn't cut the cables. No, but this place is my problem. Looks like it's our problem tonight. Leonard opened his eyes. Chris was sitting across from him now, close enough that their knees almost touched. The blue monitor light cut across his face, making him look serious in a way Leonard was not ready for. You don't have to make it yours, Leonard said. I know. Then why are you? Chris looked at him for a long moment. Because you looked at that stage like losing it would break something in you. Leonard's throat tightened before he could stop it. He hated that Chris saw too much. He hated that he liked it. It's just a theater, Leonard said, but the words sounded weak even to him. Chris shook his head. No, it isn't. Leonard stared at the floor. He could have dodged the conversation. He was good at that. A joke, a sharp comment, a change of subject. But the room was too small for lies, and Chris had been too careful with him to deserve one. I used to bring my designs here when nobody wanted them, Leonard said. The old lighting director let me sit in the booth and watch rehearsals. I was 21, broke, and convinced I was useless. He let me learn. Then he hired me. This place gave me a reason to stay. Chris stayed silent, listening. Leonard rubbed a hand over his face. My ex used to say I was hiding behind other people's spotlight, that I made everyone else look important because I didn't know how to be important myself. Chris's jaw tightened. Leonard laughed once, bitter and small. Stupid, right? No. The answer came fast enough to make Leonard look up. Chris shifted closer, not crowding him. It's not stupid when someone you love teaches you to doubt the thing that keeps you alive. Leonard's chest hurt. He had not expected that. Not from a man who looked like he could solve every problem with steady hands and a half smile. You sound like you know something about that, Leonard said. Chris looked down at his hands. Different story. Same damage. Leonard wanted to ask. He didn't. Not yet. The monitor beeped softly. 68%. Chris looked at Leonard again. For what it's worth, I saw your cue sheets. The way you build light around movement, the timing, the color shifts. That isn't hiding. Leonard swallowed. Chris's voice dropped. That's control. That's taste. That's someone telling the room where to feel. Leonard could not answer right away. He looked at Chris, and all the usual defenses felt suddenly cheap. You barely know me, Leonard said. Chris gave a small smile. You keep saying that like it helps. It should. It doesn't. Leonard let out a slow breath. His hand rested on the floor between them. Chris looked at it, then placed his own hand nearby, palm down close but not touching. Leonard understood the offer. No pressure. No demand. He stared at Chris's hand for a second, then moved his own until their fingers brushed. Chris went still. Leonard almost pulled back. Instead, he let their fingers slide together. The contact was simple, almost quiet. Somehow it hit harder than every accidental touch from the night before. Chris's hand was warm, rough, steady. Leonard's pulse settled and sped up at the same time. There, Chris said softly. What? You're breathing again. Leonard looked at him. That your professional diagnosis? No. That one's free. Leonard smiled and Chris smiled back. The room changed around them. Not safer exactly. More honest. Then the old intercom above the door crackled to life and blasted 3 seconds of warped rehearsal music. Leonard jumped. Chris flinched so hard his shoulder hit the wall. The music died. Leonard stared at him. Chris stared back. I handled that with dignity. You almost fought the speaker. It made an aggressive choice. Leonard laughed, truly laughed this time, and Chris looked at him like the sound was something worth keeping. The look warmed Leonard from the inside out. The laughter faded. Their hands were still linked. Chris's thumb moved once over Leonard's knuckle. Leonard's breath thinned. Tell me to stop, Chris said quietly. Leonard's heart kicked. You're not doing anything. I'm thinking about it. That should have scared him. It did, but not enough to make him move away. Leonard looked at Chris's mouth, then back to his eyes. If you make a joke right now, I'll hate you. Chris leaned closer. Then I won't. The space between them narrowed. Chris moved slowly, giving Leonard every chance to turn away. Leonard did not. He lifted his hand to Chris's jacket and held on. When Chris kissed him, it was careful at first, warm and steady, nothing like the chaos around them. Leonard froze for half a second, then kissed him back harder than he meant to. Chris made a low sound, surprised and restrained, and his hand came up to Leonard's waist, holding him like he had wanted to do it all night. The kiss deepened, still controlled but no longer cautious. Leonard forgot the lock, the cables, the fundraiser, the fear sitting heavy in his chest. There was only Chris's hand at his side, Chris's mouth against his, Chris pulling back just enough to breathe. Leonard, Chris murmured. Leonard kept his grip on Chris's jacket. Don't apologize. Chris smiled against his mouth. Wasn't planning to. The monitor beeped again. Backup complete. They both looked at it, breathing unevenly. Then the door lock clicked. Chris rested his forehead briefly against Leonard's. 10 minutes. Leonard laughed under his breath. That was more than 10. I got distracted. Leonard stood with him, still close. By the door. Chris looked at him, eyes dark and warm. No. Outside, the theater waited in shadow. But Leonard no longer felt like he was standing in alone. By morning, The Marlowe Theater looked alive again. Not perfect, not safe enough for Leonard to stop worrying, but alive. The center wash worked. The side lights responded. The backup feed held through 3 test runs without dropping. Chris had spent the last hour moving between the grid and the stage left rack, checking every line with the patience of a man who refused to be beaten by old wiring or bad intentions. Leonard stood at the lighting console with a copied camera file saved in 3 different places. He had already shown it to Mara and the theater director. They agreed to keep quiet until after the show, but security had been placed near the backstage doors and the damaged racks. "You look like you're planning to personally arrest someone with a spotlight," Chris said, stepping into the booth. Leonard looked over. Chris had dust on his jaw, a fresh strip of tape wrapped around one finger, and the same calm expression that had been ruining Leonard's focus all night. "I might," Leonard said. "Depends how dramatic they make it. Please don't weaponize theater equipment. Then keep the system from dying." Chris leaned one hand on the console, close enough that his shoulder brushed Leonard's. "Demanding. Competent," Leonard corrected. Chris smiled. "Still using that one? It keeps applying." The room went quiet for a second. Not awkward, just full of everything they had not had time to talk about since the kiss. Leonard could still feel it if he let his mind drift too far. Chris's hand on his waist, Chris's mouth warm against his, Chris saying his name like it mattered. Chris glanced at the stage below. "You ready?" "No." "Good." Leonard looked at him. "Good. If you weren't scared, I'd be worried." "Means you care." Leonard exhaled slowly. "I care too much." Chris's voice softened. "No such thing." Before Leonard could answer, Mara's voice crackled through the headset. "House opens in 30. Leonard, please tell me we're not doomed." Leonard pressed the button. "We're not doomed." Chris leaned closer to the mic. "Mildly haunted, but operational." Mara paused. "Was that the hot repair guy?" Leonard closed his eyes. Chris grinned like a criminal. The house filled faster than anyone expected. Former actors came back. Old donors returned. Neighbors who had grown up seeing shows of the Marlowe filled the worn red seats. Leonard watched from the booth as people looked around, touching armrests, pointing at the ceiling, smiling at memories built into the walls. For a moment, the pressure almost crushed him. Then his phone buzzed. "Chris, breathe." Leonard looked down and smiled despite himself. He typed back, "Don't let the building explode." "Chris, I make no promises about the cursed horse." Leonard laughed softly, and that helped more than any speech could have. The show began. Q1 came up clean. A soft amber glow opened across the stage. Q2 faded into blue without a flicker. By Q10, Leonard's hand steadied. By Q20, he stopped thinking about the repaired lines and started feeling the show again. The actors moved. The music swelled. Light slid over faces, caught tears, carved shadows, made the old stage look young. Down in the wing, Chris watched the racks, but every few minutes his eyes lifted toward the booth. Leonard felt it even when he did not look back. Then, just before the final sequence, the stage left warning light blinked. Leonard's stomach dropped. A figure moved near the restricted rack. Dark jacket. Capitol. Same shape from the footage. Leonard hit the comm. "Chris." "Stage left rack." "I see him," Chris answered immediately. The figure opened the side panel and reached inside. Leonard's hand tightened over the next cue. The final scene was seconds away. If the power dropped now, the show would collapse in front of full house. "Chris," Leonard said, barely breathing. "Stay on the board," Chris said. "Do not leave that booth." Leonard watched the security monitor as Chris crossed the wing fast, silent, controlled. The intruder jerked back, startled, but Chris was already there. He caught the man's wrist before he could cut the secondary line. The two struggled for only a moment. Chris shoved him away from the rack and slammed the safety cover down, but his hand scraped hard against the exposed metal edge. Leonard stood halfway out of his chair. "Leonard," Chris said through the comm, voice tight but steady. "Cue the ending." "You're hurt." "Cue the ending." The stage manager called final light in 5. Leonard stared at Chris on the monitor. Chris looked up toward the camera as if he knew Leonard was watching. "Trust me," Chris said. Leonard sat back down. His fingers found the controls. The final cue rose. Gold light poured over the stage, then widened into deep rose and white, brighter than anything they had tested. It looked like dawn breaking through a room that had been dark for years. The actors froze in their final position. The music ended. For one silent heartbeat, nobody moved. Then the audience stood. Applause filled the theater, loud enough to shake the booth glass. Leonard stayed seated, hands still on the board, unable to breathe properly. The lights had held. The show had held. The Marlowe had held. But all he could think was Chris. He left the booth as soon as Mara took over, moving fast through the backstage hall. Security had the intruder near the exit. Mara was already handing over the copied file and the damaged cable photos. Leonard barely looked at any of it. He found Chris sitting on a low platform beside his toolbox, wrapping a cloth around his bleeding hand. Leonard stopped in front of him. "You absolute idiot." Chris looked up, tired and amused. "Nice to see you too. You told me to cue the ending while you were bleeding. It was a dramatic moment. I don't care about dramatic. You work in theater. I care about you more." The words came out before Leonard could soften them. Chris went still. Leonard did not take them back. He stepped closer, took Chris's injured hand carefully, and checked the scrape. It was not deep, but his own hand still shook. Chris watched him. "Leonard." "No." Leonard wrapped the cloth tighter. "You don't get to say my name like that and make me forget I'm angry. I wasn't trying to." "Yes, you were. You do that with your voice." Chris laughed quietly, then winced. Leonard glared. "Good. Suffer." Chris's smile softened. The lights didn't go out. Leonard looked at him then, really looked. "That is not the only thing I was afraid of losing tonight." The noise of celebration faded around them. Chris stood slowly, keeping close. "What are you saying?" Leonard took a breath. He was tired of hiding behind work, behind timing, behind the safe distance of a lighting booth. "I don't want you to only show up when something breaks," he said. Chris's eyes warmed. "Then when do you want me?" Leonard stepped closer and caught the front of Chris's jacket. "When things are fine, when they're messy, when the lights are working, when they're not. I want you there." Chris's hand, uninjured and careful, settled at Leonard's waist. "As what?" Leonard smiled, nervous but sure. "My boyfriend, if you're not too busy saving cursed buildings." Chris leaned in. "I can make room." Leonard kissed him right there in the wing, with applause still rolling through the theater and Chris's hand warm at his waist. This kiss was different from the one in the control room. Less panic, more promise. Weeks later, Chris was still at the Marlowe, but nobody believed his excuses anymore. He claimed he was checking the restored dimmers, adjusting the old grid, inspecting the booth door, making sure the cursed horse behaved. Leonard always rolled his eyes, then let Chris stand too close anyway. The theater stayed open. The fundraiser brought in enough money to save the season. Leonard's new lighting program became the first show announced under the restored marquee. On the night, they tested the full system. Leonard stood at the console, while Chris came up behind him and wrapped both arms gently around his waist. "Is this necessary?" Leonard asked. "Technical support," Chris said, chin resting near his shoulder. Leonard smiled and placed his hand over Chris's. Then he brought up the lights. The stage bloomed gold, bright and steady. Chris's voice was soft beside his ear. "The night I met you, this whole place was dark." Leonard leaned back into him. "And now?" Chris kissed the side of his head. "Now I know exactly where the light is." And that was how one broken theater, one ruined lighting system, and one stubborn night brought Leonard and Chris together. Sometimes love does not arrive under perfect conditions. Sometimes it appears in the dark, stays through the damage, and helps you turn the lights back on. Thank you for listening, and I'll see you in the next story.